Welcome back to the English Hour on A.N.N. satellite television. Our guest today is the Revrd Larry Wright. He is the Religious Affairs Advisor of the Next Century Foundation. He was formerly Director of Religious Affairs, variously at the British government's Yarlswood Immigration Removal Centre and the Young Men's Christian Association, otherwise known as the YMCA. He now heads a church in a multicultural, multi-faith part of his home city, Birmingham. Larry, good to have you here on the English Hour at A.N.N. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
There are many issues I'd like to raise with you, but perhaps we could start by, in view of the fact that we live in such a war-torn world, one of the things that fascinates me particularly is the Christian's concept, and I believe it's also an Islamic concept, the concept of a just war. Can you tell us a little about this? What is the thinking behind this?
Yes, well, the original thinker behind it was St. Augustine, and that was way back in history. And then St. Aquinas refined it, but essentially the basic principles are still what the just war theory has come to represent. And those principles are that for a war to be declared, there must be a right authority. There must be some sovereign, legitimate power that has got the power to declare war. So that's the first principle. The second principle is it must have a right reason. Now that's been argued about over the centuries, but essentially it must be to deter a greater evil. So for instance, if a country is about to be invaded by a large force, that's pretty obviously something that needs to be counteracted. But then also the third principle is it must be a last resort. And this is something that, again, is subject to a lot of discussion and debate. When do you stop trying to sue for peace and give up and decide you have to commit war? And then finally, the final principle is it must be proportional. So the force that's used must be proportional to the force that's being exerted in the negative.
And that last principle, I suppose, is the one that covers collateral damage. In other words, you shouldn't be killing innocent civilians and so forth.
This is a very important principle as well. In fact, the early philosophers regarded it as only for combatants to be part of a war. They saw that innocent people, non-combatants, bystanders we might call them now, collateral damage is the other phrase, as you say, that is not part of a just war theory.
Tony Blair, excuse me, in his Chicago speech, he tried to modify this to really reduce the emphasis on collateral damage and just talk about the other principles as regards just war. At the time of the Iraq War, I think, would that be fair to say that was the case? I guess so.
Well, I think when you start debating these principles in the modern era, we have got such different weapons of warfare and such mighty power to destroy, that inevitably, comparing them with the older weapons of 1,000 years ago, there's bound to be more collateral damage. There's bound to be more destruction of buildings and of livelihoods and of land. So we have to be very careful if we start modifying those principles. The principle stands as far as the Christian ethic of a just war is that non-combatants should not be injured as part of a war.
And Islam has something similar?
Very much so, yes. Islam is a religion of peace. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, espoused peace on a number of occasions throughout the Quran. And they have a very similar just war theory. In fact, they also have a theory of how to treat the defeated, which is to be magnanimous. And Saladin was an example of this when he finally defeated Jerusalem.
Of course, if you turn to actual conflicts in today's world, and you take something like specifically the Syrian conflict, then depending on one's perspective, both the in what is a civil war, both the fighters on the government side and the fighters on the rebel side, for the basically both would claim that they were fighting a just war, and could strive to claim that they were fighting a just war within those parameters,
yes.
except for the fact that there's so much collateral damage that it doesn't qualify. But
yes, well, this is where a civil war starts to complicate the neater principles of countries going to war. A civil war is a house divided, a family at war with itself. And perhaps one of the greatest examples of that we have in the modern era was the American Civil War. Yes. And in that, again, both sides were making claims philosophically and ideologically and even divinely that right was on their side. It's not something that can be easily broken down into theories, but what we can say is the essential principles of once a war is embarked upon, then the second set of principles is how that war should be prosecuted, and the behaviour of troops and the behaviour of armies during any war, whether it be state on state or a civil war, has to have the highest principles of justice and fair treatment for all those who are either captured or injured or in some way caught up in it and are non-combatants. That's the thing. It's important, whatever the cause of the war, whether it be civil or international, it's how the innocent are treated. That is a mark of the justice of the war once it's being prosecuted.
And in fact, if you look at civil wars historically, in Britain, I know we're going back many centuries, but at a time when the British population was little more than 5 million, we killed some staggering, I think it was 100,000 Scots and 100,000 English and 500,000 Irish. If you look at the American Civil War, arguably there were 1 million dead if you count disease. I mean, their population was slightly larger by then, but the Syrian Civil War has a ways to go before it reaches those horrendous proportions, but it's pretty awesomely awful.
Yes.
I mean, the civil wars, there are no standards of honour ultimately, because in most civil wars, in the modern era, prisoners are not taken. You know, the Libyan Civil War, neither side really took prisoners. By and large, prisoners were killed. And in the Syrian Civil War today, neither side really takes prisoners. Quite apart from the issue of collateral damage. I mean, it's...
Well, these, of course, break through completely the principles of a just war and how a war should be prosecuted. In the modern era, of course, we also have another element to consider, and that is international justice. Ever since the Second World War, we have developed in the West, and it's now international, the idea of war crimes. And now there's a whole body of jurisprudence which is researched, investigated, and come up with case law. And so that's why now perhaps people won't look so much to philosophy to moderate their excesses in warfare, whether it be international or civil, but maybe the fact that they could be prosecuted as a war criminal.
But it's surely a dangerous road to go down. I mean, we've seen this in terms of for example, the president of Sudan being declared or indicted for war crimes, and that has meant that peace negotiations become much more difficult, and I mean, it's very disturbing. And also, it has a huge element of retribution about it. It's not. I mean, it doesn't leave room for the great idealistic approaches like truth and reconciliation committees. Surely, you can't. Can you really believe that this is right? This modern approach of war tribunals?
Well, I think for people who are used to a Western democratic approach to matters of these sorts, then having a legal element attached to any retribution or punishment for people who have committed what we believe to be massive human rights abuses and war crimes, that is an element of what's in our, I'm hesitating to use armoury, but an element of what we can use.
But in a purely secular sense, it certainly doesn't. I mean, the people of religion would advocate mercy even to your enemies, no?
Well, the other principle here, of course, is peacemaking. And in both Christianity and Islam and most of the major world religions, there is a perspective of peacemaking as being held up to being something of a divine pursuit, something that is worthy and noble to be doing. So if something cuts across the idea of making peace by persecuting someone for war crimes, then one could argue that it would be better to pursue the peace than to pursue the person.
Talking about justice and what is right and what is wrong, the whole ethical situation as regards refugees, I'm not talking now about the humanitarian situation, we have that, but Syria is being stripped of its part of its population in a form of ethnic cleansing, you could say, or you could argue. Countries like Sweden are taking unlimited numbers of Syrian refugees. Britain is being less generous by a mile, but nonetheless is taking a few. The whole concept of migration from war and moving refugees on so that they are unlikely ever to return, is that a form of ethnic cleansing? Is it morally right?
Well, the United Nations Convention on Refugees is quite clear that anybody who is fleeing persecution or war or conflict has a genuine case for being allowed to seek asylum in a safe country. That's a long tradition going back in all our faiths of sanctuary. The Christian Church believed that even a common criminal, if they could find their way into a church, could seek sanctuary from their pursuers, from the law. Of course, the modern world is now much more complicated, and if we remember that the convention, the UN Convention on Human Rights, was written in response to the Second World War and the emerging realities of the Cold War, then we can see it was aimed at mainly a European or a little bit wider set of countries. Now, of course, with globalization and the increase and ease of international travel, a person can be halfway around the world, be it by plane or by a leaky boat, seeking asylum for all sorts of reasons. And this has become quite a very complex political issue in the countries that are being expected to take them. The natives of some countries, the indigenous people, are beginning to feel overwhelmed. Now that's a perception that you could argue is stoked up by certain elements of the media. But there's certainly in the UK, a relatively small country, the pressure of migrants and refugees coming into the country is now a very big political issue for all the parties to address.
Do you yourself believe in a world without frontiers, or?
I think de facto we do have a world without frontiers because people can move. What we don't have adequate legal processes that can speedily, humanely and justly deal with it.
And when people, for whatever reasons, either for economic migrant reasons or for tragic situations as with the refugees from war, end up moving, I mean, there is this big argument. I say this because you were Religious Affairs Director at an immigration removal centre, Britain's most important immigration removal centre, Yarlswood. There is an argument that you have these two major philosophies with regard to migration. One is integrationalism and one is multiculturalism. And France, the nation of France, is an integrationist nation that believes that essentially you must assimilate French culture. You should be French when you come to France, and they've banned the women covering up and so on. Whereas in Britain, we have up till now accepted very, very warmly, largely egged on by our politicians, Tony Blair in the lead, the concept of multiculturalism. I mean, is it an either-or thing, or...?
I don't think it's an either-or thing, because we're talking now about government policies and social structures, and the two things don't always match. There are people who migrate for whatever reason, and we could have a further discussion about whether economic migration is a legitimate reason for moving. There are some who say it is and some who say it isn't. But what we can say is that some people, when they move to another country, will, by their nature, by their preference, or by sheer will want to assimilate. There are others who will prefer to, in some way, construct for themselves a community, a society, an area which is familiar to them as if it were home. So the social constructs behind migration will depend somewhat upon the attitude of the people who are the newest arrivals, the newest immigrants. But when it comes to public policies and when it comes to public services, then questions begin to be raised by, for instance, an obvious one is, should people learn the host language? Should they learn to speak French or American or German? And Britain has, in recent years, started to insist that newcomers to the country learn to speak English. So the idea of multiculturalism and integrationalism, I think, is more fluid than perhaps we realise.
And certainly some communities tend to be more integrationalist than others. I mean, the Iranians who've landed up in Britain as refugees have tended to integrate almost totally, whereas the Arabs and Jews who end up here tend to have their own schools or identities, or I mean, there is a difference, isn't there? Or tends to be a difference.
Yes, there is. Where there's been some of the stronger cultures with a very strong religious and cultural identity, particularly if they have been persecuted by the nature of that history. The Jews are a very good example, but there are others, will tend to have their own innate sense that they have to stick together for safety or for security, because they've been persecuted or there's been hostility towards them in the past. This doesn't take away from the fact that we have international, and I would say moral duties to care for the stranger in our midst. It's in our Christian Bible, both in the New Testament and in what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. But it's also part of Islam. And again, all the major religions have a special care for the stranger, the alien in their midst, the widow and the orphan. These are fundamental principles in most of our faiths. Part of the positive role that religion can play in any society is to remind those in power of these fundamental principles of what it means to care for suffering humanity.
Because we aren't doing very well, really. I mean, if you look at reminding those in power of dealing with suffering humanity, and you look at the refugees from Syria in the neighbouring countries, there are some examples of good refugee camps, but they are fewer and far between. And by and large, Syrian refugees, the people trafficking that goes on, the misery, the squalor, the harsh conditions, are just heartbreaking. I mean, actually horrendous in some cases. Young children, the way they are treated, and mothers, the situation of women. So you're in this kind of nightmare situation, and well, the international world weeps crocodile tears and does little or nothing in terms of humanitarian aid in relationship to the real crisis on the ground. I mean, It's very strange, really, I would say.
Well, it's almost like a double exile, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're exiled, they're refugees from their own country, all that was familiar, all that made life worth living and gave them their identity. And then they're put into a refugee camp. And then, because of the squalor and the exploitation they suffer, they are then exiled from their own dignity. And I think this is what we have to remind the people who have got the power to alleviate or ameliorate these conditions. We must press home the urgency for that humanitarian aid to be increased substantially.
Yes, they make these pledges that are in terms of billions, but then don't deliver. Looking at coming back to this whole business of different communities, you've done a lot of work on interfaith. We've seen appeals for better harmony between communities. Indeed, in 2007, I know you're aware that the Arab, or at least a major grouping of Arab religious scholars that included Shiites and Sunnis, wrote an open letter to Christians appealing for better understanding and less hostility from the Christian world. I'm not sure that we, as Christians, responded adequately to that appeal from senior members of Islam, including many Grand Muftis. But do you feel there is a need for more interfaith work, more intercultural work in terms of the religions?
Indeed. I think it's one of the greatest challenges facing us this century because in the post-Second World War world, which we're still sort of living the repercussions of, the end of the Cold War, the breakdown of the old East-West polarity between communism and capitalist ideologies, I think there are those, and I would agree with them, who would argue that religion and what religious values are being espoused in the world are now the new polarities, if we allow them to be so. And this is where I feel those who have a heart for this sort of work and a passion for it are doing the whole humanity a tremendous service. So we must support all endeavours, including the Letters of the Muslims, which is, I believe, one of the best examples of conciliatory letter, well researched, using both the Quran and the Christian scriptures to underpin its message of rapprochement, understanding and mutual development. I think we need more of that. Leaders of government, even in the West, which some would say are now highly secularized, even now they are doing God, to quote another Blairite acolyte. And during the Tony Blair time, religion was seen as something that was too complex and too potentially politically damaging to talk about. A lot's changed in 10 years.
Yes, it was interesting to see that in that letter from the Muslims to the Christians, they were quoting Bukhari. The Muslim writers were quoting Bukhari, I believe it was, who said, "Love your neighbor as you love yourself," which is very much a Christian belief as well. And yet, the irony is, isn't it? I mean, you talked of these clashes of civilization. Our great enemy was communism in the West for decades. And now our great enemy, it seems to me, is Islam. We've adopted Islam as the new enemy of the West. Is that in a post 9/11 world?
Well, I would say the biggest enemy is ignorance. And that's where we need to educate, instruct and develop this understanding. My experience of working with and living alongside Muslims for many years, and Birmingham, where I'm based now, is a very multicultural city with a very large and varied Muslim population, is held up as a city with as a model of interfaith, intercultural harmony. We've had none of the race riots in Birmingham that somewhere like Bradford had in the early 2000s. So we are working at a grassroots level as well as the leaders level for greater harmony, understanding. However, we have to be realistic. There are people out of ignorance or maliciousness who will use differences, and there are differences between the world religions, which seem at the moment to be unresolvable, will use those differences and multiply them and magnify them as a means of creating an enemy of us. And this is where ignorance prevails, because if we don't tackle that, if we don't point out what unites us rather than what divides us, then the men and women who want to foster enmity between the religions will succeed.
And in that context, I mean, fostering enmity, Syria is the whole, in a way, the whole crisis in microcosm, because you have there, I know most Syrians would deny that it was a sectarian war, but it is becoming very much, I believe, a sectarian war, where people are divided along confessional lines, and so you are finding that you have Christians and Alawites standing in one block, and then and so forth, and Sunni Arabs stand in another block. By and large, I mean that's still not exactly true, because the Syrian army, for example, is to some degree cross-cultural still, and so is the rebellion to some degree. But it's moving in that direction, moving into a sad sectarian fight, and the whole Middle East, in a sense, is moving into that kind of dynamic, because you have this fault line between Shiite and Sunni Islam that's running across the Middle East. The way forward clearly is, or I assume that any Christian would believe the way forward was discussion, peace, rather than fighting. There can be no satisfactory resolution of this through violence, is there?
Not through violence. Yes, dialogue, mutual endeavours to ameliorate some of the humanitarian problems. But the other thing we all share as people of faith is a prayer life, and a belief that prayer to the one God who created us and who made us for himself is a God who will listen to prayer. And sometimes when a situation like Syria gets so bad, I would always encourage any person of faith not to despair of the power of prayer, but also to work for peace in whatever way they can, whether it be local in their street, in somewhere in Syria where there is a possibility still of some co-working with people of other religions, of other cultures. Even small gestures of peace building make a difference in a theatre of war.
Does this make you a pacifist? I mean, are you anti-war to that degree? Would you regard war as justifiable in any circumstance?
Well, I do believe that the high standards of the just war doctrine can be applied. We could take, for instance, the most obvious one from an English point of view or Western point of view would be defeating Hitler. Nazism, like any form of totalitarian ideology, which sees everybody as inferior to itself, is monstrous and is evil in the true sense of the word, and that was a just war. So no, I'm not a pacifist, but I am a peace builder and a believer in peace, and we should attempt, as the just war doctrine tells us, to pursue peace at all costs until all avenues are exhausted.
Now, of course, the difficulty with this is where you draw the line if you're taking a just war approach. I mean, okay, so is it credible to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and so on, and you go on, and the cost of that war, you could argue that it was. But where do you say enough is enough in terms of just war? It's I quite like the concept of being not so much a pacifist, but being against violence, which is a more proactive stand, I think. And I would hope most men of conscience would feel that. But moving on, I mean, we have this crisis. We have a broken world. You're advocating interfaith dialogue. Is that enough? Do you advocate the kind of direct action for peace, that the sort of Gandhi-esque approach where people should actually intervene for peace, put their stand up and be counted?
Indeed, yes. I think that's got a noble history, both in the West and in the East, of people standing up for peace. We've seen just recently over the situation in the Crimea that there were protests in Moscow against Putin's policy there, which was a far larger in numbers protest than the protest that was going on in another square nearby. We could argue that Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. in America, the great civil rights movements and battles of the last 60 or 70 years have all had an element of what you might call civil disobedience aligned to Gandhi's non-violent principles. But I think there's something else that people of faith can offer, and that is the perspective of our common humanity. Going back to my fear of the success of ignorance over enlightenment in human affairs, is that we truly believe, if we are people of faith, that we are all brothers and sisters under one God.
Yeah,
and that should propel us forward to overcome all false or constructed enmities in order to pursue a more harmonious world.
Yeah.
It sounds ideological, I know, but if we don't keep that vision alive, William, if we don't keep a vision of a better world alive, then maybe we will succumb to despair.
But having said that, and if you say that, then where's God in this? I mean, God in the equation is the slicing through the world with naked sword, cutting through people's lives, slicing down humanity. I mean, can you blame humanity? God made us what we were, after all. We are God's creatures. We were created. We're all children of Adam. I mean, God made us what we were, what we are, and look at this world. He permits this kind of brutality.
Well, now you're entering on the question of why suffering. Why does a good God allow suffering? And it's a question that has exercised theologians of all religions and philosophers for a very long time. And I think we'd probably need another whole program if we were going to try and delve deeply and meaningfully into that question. Well, what we can say is that God created us, but God created us and also gave us free will. So that we could learn how to use our autonomy under God in order to improve ourselves. And one could argue from another point of view, yes, it is a broken world, and there are many wars and conflicts and sufferings and exploitation and people being treated terribly. But there's also a world that's full of goodness and hope. And good news for humanity. There are people working to improve the environment across the faiths and political ideals.
But coming back to the nub of it, you believe we can forgive God, because, or you don't believe we need to forgive God?
I think God needs to forgive us for the way we have marred his image in us.
Interesting. I hope we will improve. We certainly seem to be capable of gross violence, and you see the most awful abuse of human rights. We in the West are very selective, though, in the way we judge, and we do judge the rest of the world. We very rarely look at our own faults. we judge the world, and so we are completely forgiving of China with the largest level of executions per capita, one of the worst human rights records in the universe, completely forgiving of China, and quite happy to seek rapprochements with nations that are not merely happy to seek rapprochement. We run desperately eager to get their business, to seek their love and affection. We bend over backwards to honour them, and yet we're very selective. With the others, we're not so picky about.
I think you're in the realms now, William, of realpolitik, aren't you? This pragmatic approach to the world. And again, I think one of the roles of religion is to critique that publicly by the religious leaders, and even better if the religious leaders can form a united front on some of these issues.
That's up to a point the Muslims did with that letter to the Christians.
Precisely.
But we are failing in that, aren't we? Our religious leaders simply don't.
I think we should give this new Pope. I'm not myself a Catholic, as you know. I'm with the Church of England, an Anglican, but we have great respect for this new Pope, Pope Francis, and some of his pronouncements have changed the tone of the Roman Catholics' voice in the world, and I think he is a man. If he's given the opportunity to pursue some of his principles and some of his ideas, who could well be one that many religious leaders could rally around.
I'd hope so. It's certainly, there is a need for a beacon, and there's need for some outspoken talk from religious leaders, both Muslim and Christian particularly.
Well, our present Archbishop of Canterbury is another example at the moment, because he's questioned some of the attitude and behaviour of the bankers, who, as we know, in the West have been castigated for their treatment of finances and bringing about through some of their excesses the current crisis financially that we're living through. So I think, yes, religious leaders do have a role, and they can play a role. I think what's interesting is the media don't always look to religious leaders and give them the airtime perhaps they deserve. And this may be our own fault of presentation. Men of prayer, men and women of prayer, aren't always as media savvy as politicians are.
I think it is also the fact that they're not speaking out enough. I do hope the new Pope will set an example. But I mean, you look at the pictures of war. The Christians wearing crosses with guns and so on, fighting. I mean, the main fighters in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, very much an ideological Islamic extremist group, fighting in the name of religion. You get this very jihadist approach by both Christians and Muslims and others. The religion has a lot to answer for in this situation.
Well, I would say the misuse of religion has a lot to answer for, both from Christians and from all the main world religions. We've all got our pasts that we're ashamed of and should be repenting of and should be seeking God's forgiveness for, because we are, unfortunately, people who are warlike by our nature, it seems, and whether it be religion or politics, ideology or economics, we seem to be able to resort to violence very quickly. And maybe that's part of what religion has to keep working on in each generation, is to perfect our humanity, to moderate our excesses and our inclinations towards violence, and turn them towards more positive, mutually upbuilding attitudes and behaviour.
So you would place, therefore, forgiveness over justice. I mean, for example, in a post-conflict Syria, or in post-conflict Libya, or in post-conflict Egypt, for heaven's sake, which still has not moved out of crisis, you would argue for the kind of truth and reconciliation approach rather than seeking justice, because I presume that is not the religious way.
Well, we have a good example in our own recent British history of the situation in Northern Ireland, which for over 25 years was torn apart by sectarian violence. And many people, many innocent people, were murdered and blooded as a result of that. And what has happened there is quite remarkable, in that both sides of the religious divide, in that case it was Catholic and Protestant, were the labels that were used. Within those communities, there were always people working for peace, praying for peace. At the same time, there were courageous politicians who were willing to sue for peace behind the scenes. So what we see there is we see faith and politics working together to try and resolve what seems to be an intractable violent situation. Now, you can't translate that parallel to other parts of the world, but you can take some of those principles. There needs to be people who will pursue peace with justice. There needs to be people who pursue peace from a political point of view, from a community point of view, and from a faith point of view. Now, if you take South Africa as another example, there they had a much longer period of internal strife based upon, as we know, the apartheid system. And it was, again, people of faith and people of political courage who were willing to take risks for peace. And then when it came to trying to resolve the aftermath, once the political battle had been won, then dealing with the aftermath, they went for a truth and reconciliation rather than persecuting and pursuing people who had abused human rights.
But the major difference in both those situations between them and the current conflicts we're seeing is that there all parties were talked to, including the extremists. If you're talking, I mean, certainly in this current war in Syria, and indeed in many recent wars in Yugoslavia and Libya and so on, all parties have not been talked to. But specifically in this war, we talk to the Syrian National Coalition. We do not talk to, well, we talk to very few elements of the external opposition, the secular opposition and so on. And certainly inside Syria, where an entirely different set of people are engaged, we really don't talk to them. We certainly are not going to talk to Jabhat al-Nusra. I don't suppose they would talk to us either, but neither do we talk to Hezbollah, because we regard them as a terrorist group. We won't even talk to the group running the Kurdish area, because the Yakiti group, which is the predominant force in the Kurdish area, because we regard them as an offshoot of the group in Turkey that we disapprove of, the PKK. So all of those elements we talk to. We certainly don't want to talk in the public arena about peace with Iran, one of the, perhaps the key player. Whatever you think of Iran, and a lot of us are very suspicious of the Iranian role. So we are very, very disempowered when it comes to peacemaking, surely, in the context of this modern war.
Well, this is where we need to take an international approach to it. I think we have to get away from the notion, as pleasing as it is to Western vanity amongst some politicians, that Western powers can solve on their own with just a few selected allies the world's problems. We have a responsibility in a globalized world where the environment and the economies of the world are all interconnected on a day-to-day basis. We have a responsibility to find ways and mechanisms through diplomacy, either formal or informal, through religious leaders, again formally or informally, to work with people who will have an influence, a major influence on the outcome of events. So if, for, as you say, an example you give of not talking to Iran, if we have to swallow some of our Western pride and speak to people in Iran, which I think we are beginning to do now,
yes, certainly, but not on the Syrian issue.
Not on the Syrian issue yet, but my hope and prayer is that we will. Just as we need to be talking to Russia, just as we need to be talking to some of the other major powers in the region. So I think we have to take a regional and international approach to our diplomacy.
Because presumably we are looking to an outcome of the Syrian war that leads to, well, some sort of fair play, some sort of democracy, possibly a new constitution. That's achievable, you think?
I think we have to pray and work for it. Whether it's achievable or not, I think history will judge us, as will God. What we do have to bear in mind is that with our experience now of Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, how do we, having convinced ourselves if it is a just war, how do we then pursue a just peace?
Yes.
And I think this is the major question we're going to have to face for all those countries in conflict now, where the West has been influential in some way or other, both historically or contemporary politics. How do we then ensure a peaceful, long-term, sustainable country that can rebuild itself after such a tragic conflict, rebuild itself in a way that people are going to flourish, that their economy is going to rebuild, and that their political systems are going to be developed. One nation, America, Britain, even the European Union, can't do that on its own. We've seen this in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya. We need to take an international approach to this as well, to the peace building.
But having said that, and you're obviously right, we tend to have an approach whereby we don't want to look at peace building. We're looking at peace building, but we're not looking at post-conflict scenarios for a nation, in this case, in this instance, Syria. Why? Because we say, we need the peace settlement, then the parties can negotiate their own future. But the danger with this kind of approach of keeping that kicking the can down the road as far as peace is concerned, or the elements of peace building and post-conflict, the danger is that then people feel so threatened that they feel no ownership of the peace process. For instance, the minorities will go on fighting against the others because they don't see any ownership of the future, because no work is being done on post-conflict Syria. And they're simply frightened.
Yes. Of course, it's complex, and far be it from me to try and say there's an easy solution to building a peace after after any conflict, but particularly a civil war on the scale we're witnessing in a country like Syria. But there are certain key things that history has taught us need to be in place. You have to have a functioning bureaucracy in any post-war conflict area. It was one of the first things that in the wake of the Second World War that we made sure that was happening in Germany and the defeated Axis countries, that there was still a functioning civil service. There has to be economic regeneration, and that requires international aid on a massive scale in order for the infrastructure of a country to start being rebuilt. That's the second thing. The third thing is there has to be jobs. There has to be employment, and rebuilding infrastructure and economic regeneration will bring jobs with it. But it has to be jobs for local people. I'm not an expert on Iraq and what happened after the fall of Saddam Hussein, but it seems to me from my intelligent reading of the situation that far too many people came over into Iraq from other countries, usually Americans or people of the Allied nations who fought with them, and did the work and got paid for it, and there wasn't an embracing of the vast amount of unemployed people that were around, local Iraqis. So I think that was a mistake we have to learn from. So big business, yes, is important, but it has to take seriously the skills of any indigenous population that's still there, that want to work to rebuild their country. I cannot believe, William, that there aren't people now in Syria who are looking forward to the day when they can start rebuilding their country. And you mentioned the refugees, and we heard just recently it's now in Lebanon alone, it's reached 1 million. There are people there with skills and expertise. When the conflict is over, we should be encouraging them to go back and to be part of the restructuring of their country. Those are the key elements, and that's what we need to ensure happens.
And this can conquer, because presumably you believe in evil. This, and we have got an evil situation at the moment. What's going on cannot please any God we know, and presumably is satisfactory to Satan. It's a situation of chaos, and it's a nightmare for millions. You believe in the victory of good over evil, and what can the individual do, though? The ordinary person placed in this kind of situation, the ordinary Syrian, the victim. How do they conduct themselves with dignity in the face of all of this?
Well, I think of examples of the example of Yugoslavia. Back in the 90s, when that country collapsed politically, and the internal divisions that then emerged, and again a similar civil war type environment with lots of refugees, with Western countries who seemed to be impotent or unsure or too tentative about what they did. I've read many accounts of people in the former country of Yugoslavia, when it had broken down, of maintaining their dignity in the midst of so much violence. You see, when you say I believe in good over evil, yes, because I believe that we all have the better angels of our conscience that do inform us. And for some people, no matter what situation they're in, how extreme they're tempted or tested, for some people they have, call it grace, call it a form of holiness. They seem to be able to maintain their belief in themselves, their belief in their own personal human dignity, that they are a child of God, and that they are not going to sink to the level of behaviour that they see around them. That's not true.
Not to sink to retribution.
Not to sink to retribution. Yes. There are people who have spoken heart-renderingly about how they've forgiven people who have badly treated them and their family members. We saw this in the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa. We've seen it in Latin America. We've seen it in other parts of Africa, and we've seen it in our own country. Forgiveness is a powerful force for reconciliation, whereas I don't believe retribution is.
And so a last word, Father Larry, any particular last thought in this war-torn world? What would you say?
Amidst all the chaos, amidst the tumult, let us listen and hear if we can discern the voice of God speaking to us.
Father Larry. Thank you very much indeed.